Australian infantrymen have been fighting in Vietnam for 8 months, and they have built up a reputation as skilled jungle fighters.
I heard this huge bang. I thought that was close. It sounded like an RPG. It hit the tree, but the bang I'd heard were 2 AK-47 bullets ripping into my left shoulder and dislocating my arm. At 9 o'clock, the chopper came and got me and winched me out on a jungle penetrator.
Most of the trauma that comes through the doors of an emergency department is accidental, whereas in wartime, the trauma that we faced was man-made, and one had to really get used to the fact that, you know, this is what people do to each other in wartime.
World War I gave Australia the Anzac story. World War II gave us a story of victory. But what is the story Australia tells itself about Vietnam, our longest war in the 20th century? What did the Australians, most of them young men, and many of them conscripts, do in this controversial war? And how did it change their lives? The generation which fights in Vietnam is born into the optimism and prosperity of post-war Australia.
As everybody says, they were the good old days.
We just had an incredible freedom to walk, to hitchhike, to adventure, to climb trees, to swim in swamps, to play in creeks, and to do all the sorts of things that young kids today can't do, and they don't know what they're missing out on.
Even as Cold War tension spreads in Asia, very few Australians know or care about the fate of a small war-torn nation in Southeast Asia called South Vietnam.
Knew very little about it. Really did not even know where Vietnam was. And looked it up on a map and saw proximity to the other countries. But really I had no knowledge of the culture or anything like that.
19, 20-year-old men full of testosterone, playing footy, rowing boats, surf clubs, dances on weekends, girls at beer, all of that sort of thing took priority before geopolitical matters. It wasn't until you were personally involved that you started to take an interest, you know.
Why should Australia be in South Vietnam? Why are we there? Obviously, to resist armed aggression and subversion.
But when Prime Minister Robert Menzies announces in April 1965 that an infantry battalion will be sent to fight in South Vietnam, the decision is immediately popular.
I was in my first year at Duntroon then, and indeed I remember walking to mess parade at lunch, and I was just a little behind time, and there was this cheering going on, and that was because news that Menzies had announced the commitment had occurred.
In June 1965, the 1st Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment arrives in Vietnam aboard the aircraft carrier HMAS Sydney, repurposed as a troop carrier. One RAR serves with a US Airborne Brigade in Bien Hoa Province. For the first time in Australian history, we're not fighting alongside our traditional ally, Great Britain. Between 1965 and 1972, 9 Australian infantry battalions are deployed in 16 one-year tours of duty. As a battalion arrives, another prepares to leave for home, like two teams exchanging places on a deadly playing field. The young soldiers are given a pamphlet to explain why they have travelled all this way to fight.
We as a military force and as individuals are in this country to help the Vietnamese government and people to win their long and courageous fight against the communists. The product of victory is a democratic state with stable government and contented people.
I believed all the things that the government was saying, how about this domino effect, the communists coming down through Malay Peninsula, you know, over time, and then eventually Australia, you know, and I thought, oh, well, if we can stop it there, well and good, and that was part of the plan.
But early on, they're not given all the tools they need to do the job.
What some officers from the battalion did was got in a jeep with a trailer on it down to an American base at Vung Tau and said, we're here to pick up the Australian stores. And so they flogged 5 50 calibre machine guns and a water truck. And they're driving out of the depot, American guard on there with a clipboard, you know, making notes and so on. We're just picking up the Australian stores, and of course, and then they just drive out.
I mean, I can remember going to the local marketplace with the orthopaedic surgeon because we didn't have any orthopaedic instruments, and he bought a hacksaw, he bought a carpentry chisel, and he bought a hammer.
For Australia, Vietnam is a soldier's war. The Navy gets them there and keeps them supplied. The RAAF extracts them when they're wounded and protects them from the air. Medical and nursing staff patch them up. They're supported by engineers and artillery gunners. But it's the diggers and armoured crews who do most of the fighting. By the war's end, soldiers make up 97% of the wounded and 96% of those killed in action. In January 1966, Menzies retires and his treasurer, Harold Holt, moves into the Lodge. Under Holt, Australia acquires a new role in Vietnam. Our troops will take control of Phuoc Tuy province. A second battalion arrives in May 1966. 5 RAR's immediate task is to establish a base at a location called Nui Dat. The deployment is historic. 5 RAR is made up of both regs and nashos, regular soldiers and national servicemen. Menzies introduced selective national service, known widely as conscription, in November 1964.
The ballot procedure is quite simple. Numbered marbles representing all of the birth dates applicable to the men covered by this ballot will be placed in the barrel. And after it has been spun, Sir Robert will draw the required number of marbles one at a time. I will now ask the departmental officers to put the marbles in the barrel.
The first ballot takes place in March 1965.
In 1964, I won the Junior PGA Championship of Queensland, and I was first intake national service. The way I tell it is the government was so impressed that they offered me a 2-year scholarship. All expenses paid me a wage, training, the whole lot, throw in an overseas trip. Who could resist?
National service applies to 20-year-old men who, under the rules of the time, are too young to vote and, in some states, too young to drink. Like the war itself, conscription is very popular in Australia. At its peak, Nui Dat is the size of a small Australian town, surrounded by a 12-kilometre perimeter of wire fencing. Life in the Dat is noisy. Choppers land and depart. Trucks roll in with supplies from Vung Tau. There's often the sound of artillery. It's hot, humid and dusty, and thousands of Australian soldiers come to appreciate Nui Dat as a safe haven. But this little Australian oasis in Vietnam is vulnerable.
Not only was it mentally tough, it was physically tough. The only way we could defend ourselves was patrol. Patrol, patrol, patrol.
We were on call 24/7, 365 days of the year. We got no relief. We had 4 days R&R and 4 days R&C in the year, so we had 8 days off. That was it.
The Australians are allies of the Americans, but they operate with a degree of independence from the US war machine.
Well, the war in Vietnam for the Americans was a totally different kettle of fish to our war. Our war in Phuoc Tuy province was a counter-revolutionary war where we operated with stealth to close with and then kill the enemy. We couldn't afford to just go out hunting for bear, fully loaded, the way the Americans did it. The Americans had so much combat power and they were prepared to go into a war of attrition, whereas we couldn't.
Every time stepping outside the wire, there was always the prospect of treading on a mine, of being ambushed.
There was a high likelihood of running into the enemy at absolutely no notice, a very short warning, if you had any warning at all. And so everybody had to be 100% on the ball all the time.
The idea was that we didn't walk on tracks, though we sometimes walked adjacent to tracks, but basically we went through the jungle with the forward scout with secateurs, basically, cutting a way through.
And we were finding sign, but no enemy. And so we went for 3 weeks without a contact. And each day it was like winding the guitar strings on a guitar, just another notch. And so by the time we finished that, we were as tight. You know, we wanted a contact just so we could get it out of our system. But it didn't happen, and the next time it did, they made up for it.
Everything seemed to slow down. It seemed to happen in slow time. And I also had a piercing sound in my head. I think it was a physiological reaction to the stress as these people started to come down the river and got closer and closer to the patrol. We were about 3 or 4 metres away from them when we opened fire and killed the 3 of them. After we'd killed them, there was a wave of euphoria in the platoon. It had been the first contact we'd had. We'd done masses of training. We'd trained and trained and trained for about 10 months to lead us to this point. And that lasted for, I suppose, 30 seconds, maybe a minute. And then it died down when we had to get down to the nasty business of recovering the bodies and burying them.
In a year-long tour of duty, diggers averaged over 40 weeks outside the wire. In the Second World War, some Australian battalions experienced just 40 weeks of action during the entire conflict. The Australians in Vietnam fight in thousands of small contacts and over a dozen larger battles. The Battle of Bin Ba, Operation Coburg, the Battle of Coral Balmoral, the Battle of Nui Dat, Operation Overlord, Operation Hammersley. But the best known, perhaps, is the battle that gives us the date on which we commemorate Vietnam Veterans Day. On August the 18th, 1966, 108 soldiers of D Company, 6th Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment take on an enemy force of some 2,000 at a rubber plantation called Long Tan. This battle is often described as a very close-run thing, and it was.
The bullets were flying thick and fast from man to man. You'd be firing at them and you'd see them drop and you'd think, oh, you've got them. And then after a while, another assault had come in, and these people had dropped. They weren't shot at all. They would just drop, and then they'd wait for the next wave, and then they'd jump up and join that wave. So they were reinforcing themselves on their way in.
The grim determination and bravery of D Company on the ground was reinforced by skilled gunners who laid round after round of accurate artillery fire.
They knew that if they called on an Australian artillery unit to get rounds on the ground, they got them where they wanted them. You yell, we shell. But when they ordered danger close, that means we're just about not dropping it on top of our troops, but it's really close that they could be killed or wounded.
Also, dropping from above the canopy of rubber trees, desperately needed ammunition delivered by courageous helicopter crews.
They couldn't have anything else there for at least half an hour. And that's when Frank just sort of said, well, I'll go. I said, what the hell are you doing, Frank? This is, and I did. I said, this is suicide.
It could easily have become one of the greatest disasters in Australia's military history. As it is, Long Tan evokes today a sort of melancholy awe at what humans can achieve, even in the most terrible of situations. The battle is the Australian Army's most costly single engagement during the war. 17 Australians die in that rubber plantation. One dies later of his wounds. Their average age is 21. Just like the other men who fight in Vietnam, they're from all over Australia. They're from the big cities and the large towns and small places in the bush. A few days after the battle, a young Indigenous digger with D Company called Vic Simon writes home to his family.
Dear Mum and Dad, I am okay, but not fighting fit anymore. I saw that many VCs, it wasn't funny. We came back to camp yesterday and we were treated like kings. Blokes from other companies coming up, shaking our hands. Last night we had free beers 2 hours. I am glad to see camp. You'll have to cut off my arms to get me out again. I'll be holding on to that many things. I'll have to say goodbye. See you in just over 7 months' time. Vic.
According to the Australian War Memorial, over 250 men and women of Aboriginal descent serve in Vietnam, and several fight at Long Tan. During the latter half of the war, the Viet Cong in Phuoc Tuy deploy a new weapon against the Australians.
Many Australian diggers, when they were working in areas where we knew there were mines, it had a great psychological effect. You had this fear of mines at the back of your head all the time. Was my next step going to be my last?
In May 1970, Graham Edwards is a machine gunner on patrol with 7th Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment. Not long after leaving the armour-plated safety of an armoured personnel carrier, the young private takes one step too many.
I knew immediately what had happened. There was just this incredible bang, and dust went everywhere. My ears were ringing with the noise. I collapsed on the ground. I just momentarily felt an incredible sense of peace and tranquility, and I just started to drift off up into the blue sky. It was just so peaceful. Within milliseconds, I think that feeling evaporated, and these incredibly powerful waves of pain just started to break over me and rack through my body, something that was indescribable. I could see immediately that my legs were shattered and there's blood pouring everywhere.
Graham Edwards survives. but at a great cost. His shredded legs have to be amputated. Insult is added to this terrible injury when he discovers that the weapon that nearly killed him is an Australian landmine, the M16 Jumping Jack. A few years earlier, in March 1967, the commander of the Australians in Fukui, Brigadier Stuart Graham, ordered the construction of a large barrier minefield to disrupt the Viet Cong's lines of supply and communication. Against military doctrine, the minefield is never adequately protected, and the enemy quickly exploit this tactical failure.
The enemy quickly learned that there was a booby trap underneath each mine, and they learned how to neutralise those, and then they were lifting mines by the 100. And then once they'd lifted them, they deployed them against the Australian forces.
Dear Wen, last night was another disastrous night for the 5th Battalion. Another platoon walked into a minefield. When it was all over and the casualties were evacuated by helicopter, only one man was left standing. There were 28 in the platoon. It all took place pretty close to the base, and we could hear the mines going off. One of the fellows reckons he could hear the screams every so often. That's 2 platoons, nearly wiped out by stinking landmines.
Australian landmines become a major cause of Australian casualties.
The barrier minefield itself was an incredibly strategically bad blunder, and it cost many Australian lives.
Edwards returns to his wife and young daughter and begins the arduous task of rebuilding his life.
If any unit deserved a unit citation, One Westfield Hospital in Vung Tau did. Wonderful people, very professional, very caring, very skilled medics, doctors, nursing sisters, the whole lot of them. They just were so good and saved so many lives.
One final point, is it conceivable that VC could be watching this withdrawal operation today from the mountains around here?
Oh, I don't doubt that for one moment. I think he's got his observation posts throughout the province, and although he may not be able to know exactly what's happening, he's got a fair idea.
Despite their best efforts, the Australians never take full control of Fukui. The task of subduing the province is like painting the Sydney Harbour Bridge. Just when you think the job is done, you have to start all over again. The last Australian troops leave Nui Dat in November 1971.
They're going home and they're happy. Australia's 3rd Battalion withdraws from the Task Force base camp among the rubber trees at Nui Dat because the Australian government has decreed that most of its troops will be home by Christmas.
Australia's war in Vietnam officially ceases on January the 11th, 1973, when Governor-General Sir Paul Hasluck proclaims the end of our involvement. But wars never end just because the shooting stops. Some veterans return with disabilities. Others suffer health problems arising from Agent Orange and other chemicals, and many are struck down by what the war did to their minds, post-traumatic stress.
I can tell you when it first bowled me over, and that wasn't until, the 1990s.
In a place of safety, playing a sport he loved, Vasella is overwhelmed by a memory he could not identify.
I walked off the 3rd green. I looked over to the 4th tee, and there was a log on the ground in the background in some bush. And my world stopped then. I could barely move after that. I had no idea what it meant. I just had a great panic attack. It took me some time to find out, put the pieces together to find out what was going on.
In Vietnam, Vasella's platoon had been sent in to replace an Australian unit which had suffered heavy casualties in a contact.
They told us that they'd got all the wounded and dead out from the afternoon before. I walked maybe 10 metres, stepped over a log, and there was a dead Australian soldier on the other side of the log.
and the recovery process can take decades. For years, Mick Crosby kept his service in Vietnam largely to himself. Then one day in 1992, he was catching up with some friends down the pub.
We had a darts competition and I had to indicate that I would not be there for a few days. They said, "Oh, where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to Canberra." "What are you going to that place for?" And I said, "Oh, something to do with a memorial down there."
In fact, he was planning to attend the opening of this place, the Australian Vietnam Forces National Memorial.
The memorial was built over the last year here in Anzac Parade.
They ended up saying, "Well, I was a veteran too." And the other guy said, "Well, so was I." And all this time, we hadn't ever discussed it or known of each other's involvement in the military.
We've seen veterans in the crowd who don't want to march, but just want to be here. They're just looking, watching, absorbing, and being a part in their own way.
You just bottle it up. You just hold it within, and you're tight within. You're stressed, very much stressed by this. And you just don't understand why something minor might just trigger it off.
It's the beginning of Mick Crosby's long search for healing.
Well, we went down there the first year and just stood there. The second year, we went down there with our medals, but they were in our pocket.
The memorial will now become a permanent reminder of the men and women who served in Vietnam with such honour, with dedication and bravery.
The third year, we wore them. So it took a few years, even amongst military people, to put the medals on. And then we realised that we were home.